Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. And yes, today is another lesson in insanity. And we're going to be talking about what I like to call reaping and sowing. You reap what you sow. Now, what is happening in Los Angeles? Well, it's burning down. It is on fire. Pacific Palisades, Hollywood Hills, some of the wealthiest areas, some of the areas that you would reasonably believe would be the best protected against fire are burning down. So why is this happening? Well, back to reaping and sowing. Reaping and sowing. Karen Bass, mayor of Los Angeles. The mayor that has eviscerated the LA Fire Department. One, cuts funding. In conjunction with the governor, Gavin Newsom of California, prevented the movement of necessary water to reservoirs and pumping facilities that would facilitate fire protection. Now you have to ask yourself why. Again, reaping and sowing. What is this gal's background? She's a communist. She is a hardcore, at best, radical leftist communist. She was part of something called the Vagos Brigade. Venceremos, I believe that essentially means we will be victorious. The We Will Be Victorious Brigades. And what does that mean? What is victorious in the meaning of the Venceremos Brigade? What does that mean? Well, it's an organization stood up by communist Cuba, Fidel Castro. Karen Bass was an active member of this communist organization that despises the United States. And that is one reason why the LA Fire Department was cut in terms of funding. That is why unqualified members of the LA Fire Department were promoted into positions of power. These persons promoted into positions of power are also radical leftists who despise the United States. Back to the brigade. This is important. This is important to understand how you reap what you sow, how you elect Miss Bass into a position of power, an ardent communist who despises the American way of life. So let's look at this. The Venceremos Brigade is an international organization founded in 1969 by the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, right? And officials of the Republic of Cuba. It was formed as a coalition of young people to show solidarity with the Cuban Revolution by working side by side with Cuban workers challenging U.S. policy towards Cuba. including the United States embargo against Cuba. The yearly brigade trips, which as of 2010 have brought more than 9,000 people to Cuba, continue today and are coordinated with the Pastors for Peace. Friendship caravans to Cuba. The 48th Brigade traveled to Cuba in July 2017. Karen Bass. The 1959 Cuban Revolution was a key event that galvanized and inspired the growing New Left in the 1960s. Cuba became viewed as a radical and anti-imperialist third world country worthy of praise by many of the radical activists of the 1960s. In 1969, the SDS, composed of competing factions and individual priorities and visions, SDS delegates traveled to Havana and were inspired by Fidel Castro's New Year's Day speech, in which he called on Cubans to help the sugar harvest. Although the Americans originally offered to help by taking industrial jobs displaced by massive sugar harvest, Fidel reportedly responded that if North Americans were to help, they would cut cane. Hoping to unite SDS members behind the new project, the leader began planning a trip, bringing American activists to Cuba to cut sugar cane. Carl Oglesby originally presented the idea to members of the SDS, but was ousted from the SDS before it came to fruition. Bernardine Dorn appointed Julie Nisham and Brian Murphy to organize the trip. Alan Young was also partly responsible for the organization and negotiations with Carlos Rodriguez and other members of the Cuban government. While in the U.S., the group met occasionally by regions to supervise, recruit, and fundraise for trips. The trip cohort, the We Shall Triumph in Spanish language brigade, was promoted as an inspiring educational experience. The brigade itself was designed to encompass members from all radical movements in the United States, from Black Power radicals to the anti-war student activist. In November 1969, the 1st Brigade of 216 Americans traveled to Cuba from Mexico City to skirt the U.S. government's restrictions on travel to the island. The participants were to contribute to Cuba's monumental 10 million ton Zafra harvest of 1970, as well as to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. The 2nd Brigade arrived in February 1970 to cut cane and learn about Cuban life. Although the Zafra did not reach 10 million tons, the brigade continued. The Antonio Maceo Brigade was formed as a Cuban solidarity group of Cuban-American radicals that first traveled to Cuba in 1977. This is where Miss Bass comes into play, right? Many Cubans who joined the brigade were motivated to prove they weren't counter-revolutionary. At the time, the We Shall Triumph Brigade refused to allow Cuban exiles to be members, believing them all to be middle-class counter-revolutionaries. The FBI has questioned individual brigade travelers over the years. Michael Ratner, who had represented members of the Venceremos Brigade, said that visits by the FBI agents were most prevalent in the 1970s and 1980s, dropped off in the 1990s. In 2010, at least 10 brigade participants were visited by the FBI. And then you go to notable brigadists. Guess who's number one on the list? The mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. Yep. Good old Karen. So again, as Pacific Palisades burns, as the ability to acquire insurance in the Los Angeles metropolitan area will soon essentially disappear, you can thank communist revolutionary Karen Bass, who was placed in her position of power, who eviscerated the Los Angeles Fire Department. And again, another lesson in insanity. You reap what you sow. Enjoy it, LA. You deserve it. Have a good day.